Welcome back to Upside Down Data. Let's talk about Chainlink and where it might be going. So Link is a bit of an interesting asset. It was one of the first ones to rally in this big move we've seen in the crypto markets. So out of the absolute lows back here in June of 2023, it's currently up about 200%, a nice rally. But a lot of people have been getting frustrated with Link. They're saying, what's going on? It's just been going more or less sideways this whole time, while other assets like Solana or AVAX have been pumping quite hard. So a lot of people are frustrated, but I think that this is maybe the wrong way of looking at it. So I want to talk about some of our models and what they were seeing while this was happening, and how we can actually see a slightly different picture, especially if we zoom out a bit for Link, relative to the frustration and a lot of people just seemingly giving up on Link in this current moment. So let's go ahead and dive into those data. So if we start with our short-term upside downside potential indicator, this is our risk model, or one of our risk models that we have here at the channel. So higher values mean high risk, low values mean low risk, and it's reactive to moves that play out over days to weeks, so much shorter in its time horizon. And we can see what happened with this rally coming up here, this first move, this early move that Link had, really leading the crypto market. It really shot up to a very high level of short-term risk, 4.6, just about at the top of the scale. The top of the scale is 5, very high, suggesting that when it got there, it was exhausting much of its realistic upside potential, and that the downside potential was larger. And oftentimes when you get these readings, it marks either a local top or a point of consolidation where things more or less will just go sideways from there. And that's exactly what we ended up seeing. The Link market, Link just ended up chopping sideways coming off of that. But then since then, we've seen short-term risk being cooling off quite a bit, resetting all the way down now to negative 1.2, way lower, much more favorable rating than where we were all the way back here. And that was one of the things that at the time I was saying Link had a nice run, but it would be likely that we'd see some consolidation or correction from here, because you just don't tend to see an asset continue to rip up higher off of those kinds of UDPI levels. And indeed, that's what we saw. And so a lot of ways this was expected. So a lot of people were getting frustrated, saying, why can't Link go higher? If you're just looking at the data, it was reasonable that would be the case. It exhausted a lot of its plausible upside potential. But the good news for the future is that we've reset considerably. And so now if Link wanted to rally, look at all this upside that it has to work with. Instead of being all the way up here where it was pretty much exhausted, now it's reaccrued a lot of possible upside potential. And that is the good news now. This is what happens when things cool off, is it allows for a rally in the future. It might feel annoying at the time, but it's part of normal market dynamics. Similar thing played out with our long-term UDPIs. This is reactive to moves that play out over months to multiple months, a little bit longer in its time horizon. Same thing, we got to a very elevated level through here, but now it's starting to cool off. And so again, even though people were calling for a next leg here, at the time, I was skeptical of that because of how overextended it was on the long-term UDPI. And indeed, it has now started to cool off. And now you might be more likely to think that some upside could happen. And the further this cools off, just like with the short-term UDPI, the more that there might be some longer upside potential that we might be looking to see. So I think this is an important context here, because what this helps us do is ground our expectations. Is that instead of just getting frustrated and saying, if everything else is pumping, why isn't Link? This helps us see where Link stood relative to other assets. It was one of the early movers. And one of the big advantages of this is that anyone who had money in Link could have shifted those funds off to other assets. That when Link went up and hit this level, a lot of those other assets hadn't even really moved yet. AVAX had only barely started to run. Sol was still way lower. Think of how the compounding opportunities that were there. That's something we talked about a lot on this channel. And so a lot of people, I think, got caught off guard. A lot of people just thought that it would be up only, but the data were telling a different story. But now they're starting to look more favorable for Link. And ironically, they're starting to look more favorable at the exact moment when everyone's getting frustrated and a lot of people might just dump their bags thinking that Link is never going to move again. And then, of course, that oftentimes is when the market will end up moving. And so that's why I like having models, is that it helps you take out that emotion, take out the noise, what everyone's talking about on X or on YouTube, and just see what is the market actually telling us, and we can act accordingly. So obviously not financial advice, you make your own opinions, but personally, that's why I think these models are very valuable. Now, another thing that's useful to look at in the longer term perspective or medium to longer term perspective is our forecast model for Link. So this model gives us the probability of upside 6 months in the future. So how likely is it that Link's price will be above where it is today 6 months in the future? And it goes from top possible number of 1 all the way down to 0. So 1 would be 100%, 0 would be 0%, then everything else falling in between. And one of the things that was happening throughout this accumulation zone as we were here is it was actually an interesting sentiment point for Link, that as we're in this year plus accumulation range down here, sentiment just got worse and worse and worse for Link. People were getting bored. People were getting super frustrated saying, when is Link going to ever do anything? And a lot of people just gave up and dumped their Link and went elsewhere. But this whole time here, especially through here, I was saying Link is looking bullish. Even though it didn't look like it maybe at the time, maybe it looked really boring, our forecast model was clearly signaling that there was some upside that might be coming to the Link market. Indeed, that's what we saw. And we're at a similar point now where people are getting really frustrated at this sideways movement, but things haven't really changed. If anything, the models got even more bullish on Link in this time, but yet sentiment is getting really frustrated. And that's what often happens in markets, that buying the thing that everyone hates sometimes can be the most lucrative thing. This happens over and over and over again. When everyone's talking about something and everyone's talking favorably about something, so think about Solana when it was pumping, or AVAX when it was pumping, that was near the top. Not exactly at the top, so we were talking about them before they hit their top, but it was when the most of the move is already in. And that's how markets tend to be, that people will talk about the things that are moving. They'll talk about things that are moving up more favorably because price is moving up. So of course you're going to talk about more favorably. And that is what then leads people to get really frustrated they didn't get in, makes them FOMO into that asset. And then oftentimes that's just a terrible decision. It's just a lot of opportunity costs. You're investing in something that would probably have pretty limited upside by the time you invested, or is at the top, and you'd miss out on the thing that's maybe more hated, more forgotten, which actually has room to move later on. And so it's going to be interesting to see with Link if it does the exact same thing again, like it did down here. When everyone got most frustrated, that's when it went and ripped to the upside. Maybe that's going to happen again here, that as Link continues to chop around sideways, people might get increasingly frustrated, say it'll never break above $18, it's going to be stuck here forever, it's going to dump off down into this range down here. But maybe that's when it surprises them. Now, the obvious caveat of this is all dependent on the broader crypto markets remaining bullish. I think if we get a broad correction across Bitcoin, Ethereum, and everything else, I don't think Link would be isolated from that, and it could have further down to go. But the overall dynamics could still be the same, and it might just be the case that eventually everyone hates Link, and that's when Link performs well. So that's just something I think it's useful to keep in mind. It's not a guarantee by any means, but oftentimes sentiment is something that when it gets too extreme in one direction or the other, betting against it oftentimes can be a better decision than betting with it. And so it'll be interesting to see if that happens, and especially if the frustration builds as the data gets more and more bullish. That might be a sign that being contrarian might actually be a reasonable thing to do, or a reasonable position to have on the market, instead of thinking that the majority who are getting frustrated are right. So time will tell. We'll have to see how this goes out. And again, a lot of this is dependent on how the broader markets remain. But when I look at Link right now, I just see an asset that had a nice initial move, needed time to cool off, and if the broader markets allow and remain bullish, could have a nice move again later. And it would not surprise me if that move were to happen once a lot of people have given up on it. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on X. A lot of updates from our models and more over there. And go to our website, polaritydigital.io, where you can view live data from our models and more.